Hey guys, Jesse here. Throughout history, every civilization has had its signature weapon. The Vikings wielded the Ulfbert, forged from crucible steel. The Egyptians fought with the Khopesh, cast in bronze, and the Japanese samurai carried the katana, made from tamagane. In this video, I'm going to try to make the signature weapon from China, the Jian. This double-edged sword has history stretching back over 2,500 years and has countless versions and styles spread through the different dynasties. Now, this makes it a little complicated to make a truly historically accurate Jian, but I'm still going to try my best to, while also trying to incorporate my own style. Let's see how it turns out. I decided to forge this sword from Turkish twist Damascus, a pattern made by stacking alternating twisted bars of steel, and the two steels that I chose were Pop's Pro Cut and 1084. Pop's Pro Cut is a bit tougher to work with than what I usually use, but it should make the sword stronger, so I figured it was worth the extra effort.
That's kind of hot.
When I was making this sword, I was expecting to have to say something about how Damascus isn't a historically accurate blade material. But when I was doing my research, I found out that there were actually some Jian made from Turkish twist Damascus. Now, I didn't choose Turkish twist as my Damascus pattern because I saw it in that sword, so I guess it's a bit of a happy accident that it ended up lining up like that. Pop's Pro Cut is still a bit of a new material to me, so I needed to take every precaution that I could to ensure that these forge welds took perfectly. And it may not look like it, but welding these side pieces is probably one of the most important steps. In the forge, the outer pieces like to heat up faster than the inside pieces, and because of that they tend to bow out. And when you have space in between your pieces, that's just asking for oxidation, so this helps prevent that. Every time I dip my billet into quench oil, I have people asking me in the comments why I do this, and the answer is pretty simple: it helps protect the weld. When oil burns, it actually leaves a thin layer of soot, and this soot is actually thick enough to help prevent oxygen from getting in between the layers. To this day, I've never had a forge weld fail when I've done this, so I'm gonna keep doing it. I feel like a lot of bladesmiths, when they go to their first heat, they just see a big billet and they just want to start smushing it down. This can actually be pretty dangerous for your billet though. When you're going in for that first press, your steel isn't actually welded together. It's still a bunch of separate layers just sitting really close to each other at a very high temperature. Going too aggressive on that first pass is just asking for trouble. If you've watched Forge and Fire before, you'll know that a lot of people face weld flaws, and one of the reasons that these pop up so much on the show is because they're on a time crunch and they don't have time to let their billets soak. The best thing you can do for your billet is do a very light first pass and let it soak for a good 10 minutes. After that, you can basically go ham. Now that I'm confident that my welds are basically set, it's time to start drawing it out. These rounded dies that I put in my press are basically operating under the same principle as a regular crosspeen. They're really good at stretching material out in one direction without having it squish out to the sides, and that's exactly what I want.
Okay, this is basically 2" by 2". I'm gonna twist it at 3/4 inch. This billet's gonna be over 2 feet long, so I think I'm gonna draw it out to about 1" by 1 inch, cut it in half, and then individually draw those out.
I fabricated these forging dies myself, and they're a little bit crusty, but they work pretty well. One of the problems that I found is that the side of the die that I use the most is on the very, very edge of them, and this means that the dies can sometimes get loose.
My dies are moving. You see the top die moving? Oh. Rather than going to 1 inch, I'm gonna go to 1 1/4 inch. It's gonna get way too long.
To ensure that I could get the entire billet to the same exact dimensions through the entire thing, I put some stop blocks in my press. I'm not sure if they do the same thing when they're only on one side of the piece as I'm pressing, but I think they worked well enough. Now, Cole Ironworks, the company that I bought this press from, offers something called a digital press controller, but I haven't gotten around to getting one yet. Every single bladesmith that I know that uses one swears by it and says it's the coolest thing ever, but I kinda just like using my stop blocks. It's kinda like comparing a mechanical analog watch to a Garmin. The Garmin has a lot more features and it's a lot easier to use, but there's just something cool about those mechanical watches. The tool I hate the most in my shop is the angle grinder. If you've seen any of my past videos, you've probably heard me say that before. Unfortunately though, the angle grinder was the best tool for this operation. The handle was still attached, and I didn't want to have to wait for the entire billet to cool, so I just used my angle grinder and cut off the handle. One of the things that us humans are surprisingly bad at is actually estimating volume. If I were to ask you the simple question of how many ping pong balls you think would fit into a regular sized bedroom, what would you tell me? I'm willing to bet that a lot of you guys are going to say something around the order of 10,000, maybe 50,000, at most 100,000. But the answer is actually closer to a million. Back in high school, I took a class called The Art of Approximation, and this was one of the questions that our teacher asked us. Like most of my classmates, I was fairly blown away by the answer. The reason that I'm talking about this at all is that the same concept applies to much smaller pieces of steel. For essentially every single project that I've worked on in the past 2 years, I've always given myself way too much steel. For this project, I was really scared that I overcorrected and gave myself way too little steel. If you look at this billet, it looks super skinny and super long, and I didn't know if I would have enough after twisting and forge welding them back together. At this point, I was just hoping that because the Jian was a really long and thin sword, that it would end up being enough steel. With my billets finally sized down to that 3/4 of an inch, it was time to break the edges and essentially turn this from a square into an octagon. This will help reduce the risk of cold shuts and ensure that I don't have to grind super deep later on after twisting. If I think about it, the optimal shape for twisting is actually just a perfect round, but that takes a lot of time and effort to get to, so I think an octagon is a good middle ground.
I think that's ready to twist.
My preferred method for twisting something like this is to clamp one end in the press, heat up a section, and then just go ham with my modified pipe wrench. And if you look closely here, I'm twisting this one clockwise, which means that the other I would have to spin the exact opposite way. Now, the Turkish twist that I'm doing was going to be 4 separate bars stacked on top of each other. Some of you guys are probably wondering why I'm only twisting 2 bars if I'm going to be stacking 4 later, but I can simply cut these bars in half and then alternate them, and that'll essentially give me the perfect Turkish twist. One of the things that's always been surprising to me is how physically taxing twisting steel is. The first 2 heats that I took were fairly easy, it didn't really feel like too much, but as the heats kept on piling on top of each other, I started to get extremely exhausted. I like to think that I'm fairly fit. My Garmin watch tells me that my VO2 max is around a 56, but even still, midway through this twisting process, I had to go inside and take a short break because I really felt like I was about to faint.
I think my heart rate shot past 160. Oh, there's a little sweat, by the way. I didn't spill any water.
The goal for this Turkish twist was to have an extremely high twist density. If you look at the half that I already twisted on this bar, it basically looks like all thread. I think I did 12 total twists for that half, which means that for both of these billets combined, I did a total of almost 50 twists. I feel like in the past, I've done a lot of twist Damascus that hasn't had enough twists, and it just didn't look right. So for this piece, in order to avoid that problem, I just decided to twist the living daylights out of the steel.
Looks pretty good. Center's a little loose, so I'm gonna target that.
To help target the center section, I turned off my second burner so I could focus the heat a little bit better. If you look closely here, the part that's least twisted is the hottest, which is exactly what I wanted.
I think that looks pretty even.
With the twist in the billet, it was now time to get them back into a square cross section to prepare for the next forge welding step. One of the things I noticed when pressing with the 3/4 stop blocks again was that I could get a little bit of a flat but not get it to a perfect square, so I had to decrease the stop block height to get it to that square. One of the things I was really scared of here was that the thinner stop blocks meant the piece was going to be even thinner, and that would make the forge welding even more precarious.
Oh my gosh. Oh, I think I lost 10 pounds in sweat.
Directly out of the forge, there were actually a lot of dirty ends that I needed to cut off. And this is because both the press and my pipe wrench need material to hold onto, and that material never gets twisted.
That's not cutting.
Even though I let my billet cool inside the forge super slowly, the Pops Pro Cut on the ends was still far too hard to cut with a bandsaw. And luckily for me, this meant that I got to revisit my favorite tool in the shop. Luckily though, because the steel was already so thin, it didn't end up being too bad. Now, the center of these billets was probably soft enough for me to cut with the bandsaw, but I decided since I was already at the post vise, I might as well just cut them in half with the angle grinder again. I spent an embarrassing amount of time trying to decide whether to stack the billets like this or like this. But what I've realized is that they're actually the same. You just need to flip the billet. My tool of choice for grinding the mating surfaces clean was my surface grinding attachment from Beaumont Metalworks. I could have used a lot of other stuff here that may have been faster, but I really wanted those flat surfaces. One of the interesting things about using a surface grinder or surface grinding attachment with sanding belts is that you don't really want to use new belts. Part of the reason for this is that it just destroys your belts, but the other is that you don't really even get a better finish with new belts. This style of grinder relies on the flatness of the belt and the wheel underneath. So if you use a fresh belt and grind something that's not the width of the entire belt, you're going to wear the grit unevenly and it'll be basically unusable for other stuff as well.
Steel all looks pretty good. Like, I don't see any broken welds or like cold shuts. Just looks like clean, twisted steel. One of these is slightly taller than the rest. I don't know why, but...
I decided that using clamps here was probably better than the vise to hold everything together. This would ensure that the pieces were centered to the piece right next to them and not rely on that flat plane getting only one side flat. The plan before any forge welding was to basically MIG weld every single seam of this billet. This definitely seems a little overkill, but when you think about it, all the time that went into twisting and prepping that first billet relies on the success of this forge weld. So I thought that welding a little bit more, welding every seam, was a worthy sacrifice of my time. That's what I thought before I actually started welding. It's insane how long this welding process took. After welding the first little bit, I realized that it was putting a lot of stress on the billet, so I decided to tack a little bit more of the billet. After doing that, I finished welding the first one, and then I realized that I'd only done one of 6 seams, so this entire process actually took me like half an hour. My hands were super sore, my finger was cramping, and my MIG welder was probably crying on the inside. But nevertheless, after all of that, the billet was now fully protected and ready for forge welding.
Ah, finally! Holy shit! That's some hot steam.
During the forge welding process, I was not only going to make this a little bit thinner width-wise, but also thickness-wise, so I wanted to make sure that these welds were ground fairly flat before any of that. I didn't want any MIG weld to contaminate my final piece, and this would ensure that those welds didn't get pressed too deep when I was drawing it out. The billet was already welded, and I could already do a 0 atmosphere forge weld, but I decided to dip the billet in oil anyway. It doesn't really cost me anything extra to do this, and it would also help seal any gaps that I couldn't see in my welds. To set this forge weld, I did a very light first pass just like I did with my first billet, and then I just let it sit in the forge for around 10 whole minutes. I had to be extremely careful because the billet was so tall and so narrow that if I pressed too hard, it could accidentally cave in the entire billet. I promised you guys in the comments last video that I'd talk a little bit about how I started bladesmithing, and I think now's a good time to tell that story. I'll also share a bit about the journey that brought me to where I am today. I first discovered blacksmithing back in 8th grade when I stumbled across a YouTube video of someone forging a dagger. Obviously, I thought this was the coolest thing ever. Afterwards, I binged basically every blacksmithing video I could find until I convinced myself that I knew enough to try it out. That weekend, my dad took me to Home Depot, and we grabbed a bag of charcoal and some bricks and set up my first forge with the help of my sister's hairdryer. Needless to say, it didn't go perfectly, and blacksmithing was a lot harder than it looked. Over the next couple years, I kept experimenting, burning through piles of charcoal and getting soot everywhere. 3 years later, in 11th grade, my dad was kind enough to help me upgrade my tools. He got me stuff like a propane forge and a nice petting house anvil. From here, I spent countless hours working on my forging basics, forging more leaves than I could count and getting some of the craziest blisters on my fingers. Through it all though, I developed the hammer control that helped me transition into making knives fairly smoothly. The next 2 years after that, I spent time growing my Instagram, making and selling chef's knives to clients found through social media, and experimenting with new techniques. At this point, I couldn't really see myself doing this full time, and it was just more of a hobby that paid for itself. Let's fast forward to my second year of university. Out of nowhere, I get an Instagram DM from a casting agent on Forge and Fire. I knew this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, so I answered and we started talking. After a bunch of interviews, the show gave me two options. I could compete in a classic 4-person episode, or risk it all in a new event called Gladiators of the Forge. It was King of the Table style, where if you won your one-on-one battle, you could live to fight in another round. After some back and forth, I decided to go big or go home. I decided to compete in the Gladiators tournament. Somehow, I managed to win all 8 battles I was in, and I took home the grand prize of $50,000, and I used it all to build the shop that you see today. I think I would say that that experience completely changed my life, as it gave me the tools to start making Damascus and push my craft further than I ever thought possible. Without the show, I probably wouldn't have made a single YouTube video, and definitely not turned this into a full-time career. I feel incredibly lucky to be doing what I love every single day, and I know how lucky I am for things to have turned out this way.
From what I've seen, the length of the Jian should be the length of your arm, from the tip of your fingers to your shoulder joint. I'm gonna make this one according to my body shape and dimensions. We're looking at about 28 and a half to the center of my shoulder. It's actually pretty long, but that's actually historically accurate.
With a blade length of 28.5 inches, this was going to be the longest blade that I've ever forged. Previously, the longest was Shusui at 25.5 inches, so this was a whole 2 to 3 inches larger. For the most part, this doesn't complicate things too much, and the thing I really have to worry about is whether I can get this to fit in my heat treating oven. Luckily though, Jian have a lot shorter tang than katana, and I was pretty confident that I could get this to fit in my oven. Alright, so this is what the end of our billet looks like right now. If I were to forge a tip just straight from this, it would kind of just look like all of the lines were going to the tip. It can look cool, but that's not what I want to do with this. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to cut out a piece like this from there. So all of this is going to be gone. And then I'm going to forge weld these together. So that once I have a tip, rather than looking like that garbage, it's going to look, which I think is much cooler. Essentially, the Damascus is going to follow the profile of the blade, and all of the twists are going to converge. The twists are going to converge right here. It's going to look very cool. The welding operation that I just described is something called a fish mouth weld, or at least I think it's called that. It's a lot more complicated than everything I've been forge welding so far because I have to do this without any prep. I essentially have to hammer it down and then forge weld it together by hand. I was fairly confident that I could do it without any issues, but having only seen other people do it and not having done it myself, there was a lot of things that could go wrong.
I have an idea. For the most part, getting flux to stick to steel that's cold is basically impossible. So I'm gonna have something for it to stick to. Just a little bit of quench oil at the tip. Is this gonna work? I don't know. Oh my god, this might be genius. I think this is gonna work.
Between every single heat of me forge welding these two lips together, I was basically fluxing the entire thing. When the flux melts, it forms a glassy surface that helps keep oxygen from hitting the steel. And I usually say that flux is only meant for fixing forge welds, but for a forge weld like this, you really want to have something protecting it. If you guys are curious, the flux that I'm using is just plain old borax, the stuff that you would use for laundry.
It's still just the very tip. I can't contact it. What's going on? Close, god damn it. I think I cut my fish mouth, whatever it's called, a little bit too shallow, so the angle is too obtuse.
I tried basically everything to get the very, very tip to close up, but none of it really worked. I tried the cross peen, I tried thinning down the entire thing to make the angle a little shallower, but nothing really worked entirely, so I decided to just save it for the profiling and lose a little bit of tip. With the tip welded, the rest of the forging process was actually really simple. All I had to do was draw out my tang and then get the blade up to its length. I didn't need to forge any bevels or anything. And the reason that I can do this is because Turkish twists is a fairly unique Damascus pattern. It's one of the only patterns that changes as you grind into it. It goes from a bunch of diagonal lines to a bunch of stars, and I really wanted those stars to be on my edge. Some of you are probably thinking that I'm only doing this to save time, but it takes so much less time to just forge the bevels in as opposed to grinding them.
Pretty short tank for now. I'm gonna dry it out more later by hand.
One of the most important attributes of the Jian is the distal taper, both in the width and the thickness. Generally, the ones that I saw online tapered from around 1.5 inches wide all the way down to 1 inch at the tip, and in terms of thickness, they went from a little over a quarter inch to around 150 thousandths. I kept those measurements in my head as I did the rest of the forging, and essentially all I did for the rest of the forging was thin down the blade to get my thickness and make sure the blade didn't get too wide. The blade was at length now, so all I needed to do now was finish out the tang, make sure everything was straight, and then we could finally move on to the next step.
All right, normalizing at 1650, 7000, right? Yep.
I chose the temperatures for normalizing this blade according to the heat treating sheets for 1084. Pop's Pro Cut was designed to be heat treated in a much larger range of temperatures than 1084, so using 1084 temperatures is perfectly fine. I've talked about the reasons for normalizing so many times that I feel like a broken record at this point, but it's such an important step that I need to talk about it again. Directly out of the forge, the steel in the blade is in a pretty bad state. The grains in the steel are fairly big, the carbon is unevenly distributed, and there's stresses everywhere. These 3 cycles of normalization help fix all of this and almost guarantee that the quench later on will be successful.
Okay, I need to see how much this thing weighs before I do any grinding to it. That's actually ridiculous. The final weight for this sword is going to be around 1.5 to 2 pounds, which means there's 3 swords in here. That's actually crazy.
Do you guys remember when I talked about being scared of not having enough steel? Well, that prediction was entirely wrong, and now I have to deal with a blade that's almost 5 pounds. It can be argued that this isn't really a problem though, because it's definitely much better to have too much steel at this point than too little. With the scale ground off, it was time to deal with the tip of this blade. The very tip of the fish mouth didn't forge weld well, so the only way to fix this was to just grind it off. Luckily, when it was all over though, I only had to take around a quarter inch of length off the entire thing, and I'm pretty sure that the bars still converged at the tip. After a little bit of light profile grinding, it was time to start hogging off a lot of material off either side of this piece, and the best tool for that is actually my surface grinding attachment. I'm not gonna lie, surface grinding something that was more than twice the length of the attachment was a little bit awkward, but it actually went by pretty fast. I don't think I can guarantee that the entire thing was the same thickness because it was so long and could have put some weird torque on the grinding attachment, but I still had so much thickness and I hadn't even quenched yet, so I thought it was a worthy sacrifice. It was now time to start prepping for the quench, and that meant cleaning up the flats a little bit more with the flat platen and then breaking all the corners to ensure that the blade didn't crack in the quench.
Alright, we'll austinize at 1500 again. That should be good. I think if I wanted to be safer, I would go slightly colder, but there's 1084 in here with the Pro Cut, so I think 1500 is good.
I was a little scared of the blade warping post-quench, so I decided to try something that I saw a lot of other bladesmiths do, but I've never tried, and that's essentially to clamp the blade in between 2 pieces of wood right after the quench.
Alright, lock the in.
Do you hear that? Do you hear the wood cracking? Something's cracking. Better be the wood. I think now we just wait for the kiln to cool down, then we go in for the temper. Okay, it's been about an hour, and the kiln is now at 357 degrees. All right, please don't be cracked. Okay, I don't see any cracks. Oh my god! Look at that. She's globally pretty straight. The tip curves downward just a little bit because I think the wood itself was a little bit bent. But damn!
it's not touching at all. Maybe clamping isn't such a bad idea after all. All right, let's go in the temper. Easy.
But yeah, that quench went pretty well. The blade was hard, it was mostly straight, and all I needed to do now before I could do my final grinding and hog off a lot of material was to get the sink straight. And before I could do that, I had to grind off all the decarb. The method that I was going to use to straighten this sword was my trusty carbide ball peen hammer. The reason that this works at all is because my steel was tempered to around 60 HRC, and tungsten carbide on average is around 80 HRC. This means that wherever I hit with the hammer creates a small indent that increases the surface area on the side that I do hit, and this means that it dishes the blade the other way. I'm not sure who came up with this first, but whoever is definitely a genius. To start the final grinding process, I threw on a fresh 36 grit belt, and I just started hogging away material. The thing is, the belt was so sharp and the steel was so hard that the sparks coming off had so much energy, and I actually set my dust collector on fire. This meant that I probably couldn't use it for the rest of the grinding process, and I just reverted to using my old bucket of water. This meant that there would be a little more dust flying around the shop, but at least everything would be on fire. The funniest thing happened recently. In my last video, I finally gave my Instagram a shoutout, and I put a QR code on screen and everything because I was shadow banned at the time. I knew for certain that if you searched up my name and you weren't following me already, that you wouldn't find my account. Luckily, or I guess unluckily, the day after I released that video, my account got its green checkmark back and I was unshadow banned. Since then, I get like a comment a day about how I'm not shadow banned and they could find my account just fine, and I think that's just kind of funny.
Alright, I've been grinding for about an hour. Let's see how much we took off. Okay, about half a pound. I want this to be at 3 pounds or slightly less before I start any of the beveling, because that means I'll take off approximately half the weight, and we'll be at 1.5 pounds.
Traditionally, the grind that was put on the Jian was a double convex grind with a central medial ridge. I'm going to be doing something a little bit different though. Because my blade is Damascus, and I would have to etch it later, I couldn't put a zero grind on the blade. If I did, the etch could eat into the edge, and I would have to put a secondary sharpening bevel on it anyway. To save myself the hassle, I'm just going to be putting a flat ground diamond grind onto this blade. If you think about it, doing a flat diamond grind essentially halves the weight of your blade because you take off half of the material. My goal weight for this blade was around 1.5 pounds, so before any beveling I wanted it to be at 3 pounds.
That took forever. 3 pounds exactly. Alright, right above the guard or whatever, 0.284, which is slightly bigger than what I wanted, but that's okay. Goes down to 0.27, 2.5 in the middle, and then at the very tip, we're at 212 thou. I think that's pretty good. It already feels a lot more balanced. So much more wieldable now.
I spent like 15 minutes trying to scribe a line in the middle of the blade, but it was pointless because my blade was tapered, so I'm not going to show you too much of that. One of the most important things to know about grinding a central medial ridge is that the ridge doesn't actually form until you're almost done grinding. Let me try to explain this in the best way that I can. This is what the cross-section of my blade looks like right now, and this is what my goal cross-section looks like. What a lot of people will tend to do is go from this, to this, to this. But what you want to do is actually go from this, to this, to this. Forming the ridge too early will almost guarantee you that your final ridge is going to be wobbly and uneven, but leaving it for last will give you room to do some final corrections. I forgot who I learned this next trick from, but the trick is to leave the tip for last. The tip is probably one of the most complicated things to grind on a sword with a central medial ridge, and by leaving it for last, you'll have guidelines, which are the bevels. Sure, it'll look a little bit weird as you're grinding, but everything looks weird when you're grinding. It only looks good at the very end.
Wow, that does not look centered, but I know it is.
When I was doing my research for this sword, it was actually really difficult to find out what an authentic Tang looked like. I did so many different Google searches with so many different keywords, but the only thing I could find was pictures of finished blades with all the fittings on. And because I couldn't see underneath all of those, the only thing I could do for this sword in particular was just default to an ABS style Tang. I know most of you aren't affiliated with the ABS or know what I'm talking about, but it's essentially a squarish cross-section Tang with plunge lines running into the blade. I had no idea if this was the traditional way to do it, but because I didn't have any guidelines on what was traditional, I felt like it was okay. From my experience, there's only really two major styles of plunge grind. The first one is the rounded plunge grind. It's aesthetic, it feels good in the hand, and there's so many techniques that makers can use to make them. The recent technique that's been spreading like wildfire is the waterfall platen technique from Kyle Royer. From what I can tell, it's fairly easy to learn and produces great results. The second style of plunge grind is the sharp 90-degree plunge grind. It's a little tricky to get clean, but it looks really nice when done well. Mastersmiths such as Rodrigo Alfredo and Dino Tamfranco do this on their blades. I personally also prefer to do this style, and I think in a world where everyone does the rounded plunge lines, it doesn't hurt to do something different. The problem with this style though is that I found that it's super hard to do it when the blade isn't fully ground and when the blade is super thin. So I decided to go back to the blade, clean everything up, final grind that medial ridge, and then go back and clean up the plunges.
Okay, honestly, I think that's good for now. A little bit more cleanup is needed before I'm happy to call it like a final grind. But I think this is ready for the next step. It's not bad. It has come to my attention that these straight plunge lines look really bad, and I want to do something like this, where they sort of sweep in. I don't know if I can do that, but it would be cool if I could. That looks pretty bad. My plunge lines look like it. I think the only way to fix that is to grind them in manually with a carbide burr. I've never done this, but I've seen people do it. Alright, chances of this going horribly wrong are actually quite high, which is a little higher than I would like them to be, but... Wow, this is so bad, I don't actually know how Chinese Jian Tang is supposed to look, but objectively, right now the blade is still a little heavy and a lot of the weight is in this extremely chunky Tang. And I'm struggling with my plunges a lot right now, so what I'm gonna do is just, it's the same way the katana bevels carry on into the Tang, I'm gonna carry these into the Tang. Like, there's actually a chance that this is how it's supposed to be done.
I take a decent amount of pride in my grinding ability, so admitting defeat to these plunge grinds was pretty disheartening. Luckily though, I think in this case it ended up making a better final piece. Like I mentioned earlier, the rectangular Tang had a lot of weight in it, and by grinding the Tang to a diamond cross-section, I could lose even more of that weight. It also opened up the door to some cool ornamentation that just wouldn't work if I had done the square ABS style Tang. It kind of feels weird to say this, but I'm almost happy that I failed the plunge lines and that I decided to go for this style of construction. When I was happy with those grinds, it was time to bring the blade up to a state that would be ready for hand sanding. This belt that I'm using here is called an A45 Trizact belt, and it's one of the best belts that I've found to remove those final scratches to make hand sanding easier.
Not too shabby. Alright, let's see what this final blade looks like. 1.5 pounds. 1 pound, 8.8 ounces. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. I think historically that means with all the fittings attached, this is going to be one of the heavier Jian, which is crazy because it's already so light. Time to rub sandpaper on this for the next 10 hours. Hey buddy, you want to smell it? Do you approve? Okay. Why is this thing so long?
I think I'd say that my hand sanding setup is one of the most sophisticated setups that I own. It's a bespoke 2x4 cut to an exact 2-ish feet, and I carefully cut out random slots just in case I needed to hand sand something with an integral bolster. If I had to describe the exact goal for hand sanding, it would be a combination of two things. The first of which is that I'm here to polish the blade and get it ready for the etching that I'm going to do later on. The second thing though is that I want to true up all the lines, which is why I spent some time with the file there cleaning up the very tip. Of all the steps in the knife making process, I would consider this one of the most arduous and time consuming. However, it's also one of the most important by far. When you etch a blade, the thing that directly correlates to the quality of that etch is the quality of the finish you have on the blade beforehand. If I went straight into the etch with this machine finish, you would see all of those diagonal scratches. A lot of time goes into the pattern making, so it would be a real shame to have your eyes go towards the scratches rather than the pattern itself. Because this sword was a lot longer than what I usually hand sand, I had to do it in two different sections. For my two lower grits, 220 and 400 grit, this didn't really matter because they weren't going to be the final finish on the blade. The last grit though, 600 grit, I would have to find a way to do full length scratches, but luckily I was doing that right before the etch, so that was for future me to figure out how to do. When I finished sanding the blade to 220 grit and moved on to 400 grit, I switched to sanding diagonally. This would ensure that I could see exactly when I removed all the 220 grit parallel scratches. It's so important to do this because a 220 grit scratch can be seen really clearly in a 600 grit finish. Once I was done with 400 grit, I decided to spray some fluid film across the entire length of the blade. This would help ensure that the blade wouldn't rust while I made all the fittings. I also didn't really want to scratch the blade though, so I coated the entire blade in this green masking tape. It would definitely be really annoying to somehow scratch the blade really deeply and then have to get it out later with 600 grit.
There's something on some Jian called a Tunkou, but it's basically like a Japanese katana habaki. I want mine to look something like this. I don't think there's any overhang on both sides. That's a much more complicated construction. So in essence, I need two pieces that look like this, and I also need two wedges that fit onto this side and this side. I don't know how to make this. Okay. I just realized there's a much easier way to do this. Rather than two separate pieces, you make one piece that looks like this. Once you make these wedges right here, grind off this material and you can grind off this material. So basically it's like a habaki where I wrap it around and then I make two wedges. Yeah. Okay. Easy.
Little did this fool know that it was not in fact easy. I started off by cutting an 1/8 inch thick piece of brass that was about double the width of my blade. Then I started tackling the bend. I did this in my post vise using a hammer, but then I realized that getting that super tight corner at the bend was super difficult to do. I tried to make this easier by annealing it frequently and making an exact cross-sectional recreation of the blade and using that as a sort of stencil. This seemed to work at first, but then I realized that I had cut myself slightly too little material and needed to restart. So I restarted with slightly more material and got it to the same point as the first one, and then I started to hammer it onto the blade itself to mold it to its final shape. I had done this many times before on my Japanese pieces with my copper habaki, so I thought that it would be easy. It was not easy. The side opposite the bend kept popping up and not contacting the blade. I tried to fix this with more annealing and hammering, but sometimes in the annealing, I closed the entire thing up and I had to reopen it again and do the entire bending process. I kept going back and forth between hammering, annealing, hammering again but more frequently, more annealing, and then eventually I just gave up.
What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go back to this idea. Now that I think of it, this idea is easier than this idea. So I don't know why I wanna do this one. I'm gonna get out two pieces, bend them, make the wedges, and then just solder it and hope and pray that it actually works.
This is one of those times where I thought I found a technique that would both save time and make a better product, but it ended up doing neither of the above. Luckily though, brass in this small quantity isn't super expensive, so the only thing that I wasted was my time. To ensure that I started with two pieces of brass that were the exact same size, I superglued the two pieces together and I decided to actually profile them together. I wanted the Tunkou to look the same on both sides, and this seemed to be a good way of starting. I drew on the whiteboard earlier a design that sort of looked like this, so I thought that it would be a good idea to grind out a good sized section in the middle to make the bending a little bit easier. I didn't finalize the profile right away, just so I had room later on to fix things if needed. I was actually extremely scared to bend the pieces right away, so I decided to do something else and just work on those little wedges. These wedges have to be perfectly sized. They're the only thing holding the entire Tunkou together. If they're too big, there's going to be a gap between the Tunkou and the blade, and I didn't want to just grind a piece of brass 50 times until I got it to the right shape. So I spent more time than I would like to admit overcomplicating this simple math problem on the whiteboard. If you want to see how dumb I am, you can watch that frame by frame, but for now, let's just move on to the grinding itself.
Okay. I need to grind bevels to those lines.
Brass is a copper alloy, which means that it heats up fairly fast when you're grinding. You'll be able to see this if you look at the water super closely. It actually starts boiling if I leave it on the grinder for too long.
Alright, so now these should be very, very close, if not exactly the same cross-section as the blade. And these pieces are gonna go in this negative space right here. So now what I need to do is cut these out and then bend the outside pieces and then clamp them to this and then solder. And then it should fit on this.
Generally, I'm fairly confident in my math, so I was also pretty confident that once I cut these wedges, they would fit essentially perfectly. However, my math doesn't account for how accurately I can actually cut these out, so I had to be really careful here. Straight off the bandsaw, these wedges were almost perfectly sized, but they were a little bit too wide, so I took them over to the disc sander and brought them down just a little bit. The wedges were fit, so it was time to bend these face pieces, but I decided to just final shape them here because it would be more difficult to do once they were bent. I also decided to simplify my design just a little bit and do one big hump because it would be really hard to get the two humps very symmetrical.
Alright, it's bending. Let's see how that looks. Not quite. Needs a little bit more bend. Tiny bit more. That actually might as well be perfect. The only problem is that there's a little bit of gap underneath the center because it's not perfectly flat, it's domed. This is like the skill set of an armorer, which I am not. Oh, that's hot. That's pretty smexy. Oh yeah. Oh, okay. I think the best way for me to secure these together before I do any soldering is with wire. Oh my god. Let's go. Look at that. Perfect cross section. Everything is in place. Some flux in there. Torch, why are you so bad? Yeah. Ow. Okay, that went quite well actually. There's a little bit of excess solder at the bottom that I have to file out. But the test is whether it stays together after I take this off. Like it's one solid piece now.
I was really excited with how it was looking so far, but there was a little bit of extra solder that I needed to file out to ensure that it actually slotted onto the Tang.
These.
I used way too much solder to solder these pieces together, and there was a little bit blocking it from going on the blade all the way. So I used my carbide scribe and I just tried to scrape out as much of it as I could. When that was done, I put it back on the blade and I ground off some of the extra width. I left it a little bit wide because I didn't know if it would go on the Tang square, and this would ensure that it was aligned perfectly to the rest of the blade. After that, I simply cleaned up the flats on the grinder because it was looking a little bit ugly from the soldering and I wanted to true up my lines just a little bit.
I'm gonna call that good for now and start moving on to the other pieces. One of the things that I've realized is that Jian guards, they can basically look like anything. If you go to any different era, you're gonna find different styles of guard. So I can't really make a wrong guard. I don't think I wanna do something like this, where there's a curve toward the blade, because that just makes this area a lot harder to do. I wanna try my hand at some file work. So the design I came up with, I want it to be sort of a reverse seashell scallop, whatever you wanna call it. Have a bunch of scallops and then transition into the handle. And I want this right here to be no longer than 1 inch because brass is so dense. For the pommel, I want it something similar as well, but it also can't be too heavy.
Now that I had a general idea for what I was going to do for my handle, it was time to cut some material and get it slotted onto my Tang. The reason I wanted my guard to be no taller than 1 inch is that I was going to use brass, and brass is really dense. Now, making the slot in my guard wasn't going to be as easy as milling a slot or just drilling a bunch of holes. My Tang was diamond shaped, so I needed to drill a large hole in the center and then mill with a smaller end mill a very specific distance away from the center, and then come back later and file it by hand. I really wanted to minimize the time I was going to spend filing because this was 1 inch of brass, so I tried to find fairly exact measurements to mill to. It's been about 10 months since I've gotten my Precision Matthews mill, and it might be the best purchase that I've ever made. I've come to realize that saving time doesn't necessarily cheapen the piece I'm working on. It actually gives me more time to work on other smaller details that can enhance the piece, while also taking some load off my body. I think it actually enhances the quality of my work overall, and I'm really happy that I decided to get it.
Oh my god, that actually worked. It's not a perfect cross-section, but that's what files are for. I love how easy to file brass is. I've been here for, honestly, not too long, maybe like 5-10 minutes, and I'm almost done with 1 of the 4 sides. That may seem slow, but that's actually pretty fast. Look at that. Let's see how that fits. Okay, about halfway. Oh! Okay, that's basically fit. I didn't expect it to fit so soon.
I really wanted to recess the Tunkou into the guard for a cool effect, so I bought the largest end mill that I've ever owned, and I milled the slot around 1/4 inch into the guard. I saw that a lot of historical pieces had something like this, so I wanted to try and do it on my own piece.
That is so cool. Look at that. It's like a perfectly milled out channel. And now, the habaki insets into the guard. And that gives us even more tang. So it's like, it's a double whammy. Oh my god. Look at that.
Now that my guard was essentially fully fit up and ready for shaping, it was time to start fitting my handle block. The wood that I decided to use for my handle is an Australian hardwood known as ringigi. It's extremely dense and beautiful, and perfectly matches the dark brown wood that I had already chosen for my saya. One thing that you'll notice about the piece that I cut is that it's fairly long, at around 5 inches. In fact, it's so long that my Tang doesn't even extend all the way through it. The reason that I chose to do this is actually a combination of a lot of things. First, essentially every Jian that I saw online had quite a long handle. If you compare them to something like a Viking sword, you'll see quite a large difference. In order to stay as traditional as I could, I decided to keep my handle fairly long. As for how I was going to attach my pommel later, I was going to weld on a piece of mild steel and then thread it, giving it a place for the pommel to attach.
This is what a 1/4 inch end mill usually looks like. For a handle block 5 inches long, you can't do anything with this. I got this suggestion from Rick Hall. Look at that thing. This is gonna hopefully help me mill out the handle block a little easier than with drill bits, because you're not really supposed to mill with drill bits.
What I'm doing here is essentially the same thing as I did on my guard. This 1/4 inch end mill is a lot smaller than that central hole that I already drilled, and it'll help me carve the slot a little bit easier. The only thing is that it kind of sounded terrible when I was doing the entire operation. I felt like I was going to snap my end mill and I would have to buy a new one. Now, the slot that I'm carving in this handle is a little bigger than I did in the guard because the plan was that I was going to bed it. I really wanted this handle block to sit essentially glove tight to the Tang, and doing that with files and broaches would pretty much take forever.
That's pretty good. I only have an inch left to fit. I have a good feeling about this. Does not fit all the way. It is with great sadness that I am doing this trick. What should have been a 5-minute operation has now turned into an hour. All right, Tunkou, guard, boom. Not perfect, obviously, but this is pretty damn good so far.
Okay, that took a lot longer than expected, but now it's finally time to weld on the extra steel to the end of my tang. Here I'm just grinding a really short taper on the end of my tang and on the little piece of steel I'm welding to ensure that the welds had full penetration. The last time I went for this style of construction, I went with 632 threads. It ended up working perfectly fine, but for a sword this large, I want something a little more chunky. I decided on quarter 20 threads because it was the largest one that came in my tap and die set, and for a quarter 20 I needed to grind my mild steel to around 240 thousandths in diameter. Now, there's definitely other methods that I could have chosen to put threads on the end of my tang. Makers such as Jordan Lamotte and Salem Straub braze a bolt to the end of their tangs. It's much faster to do what they do, and the connection point would be just as strong, but I don't have an oxypropane torch or any knowledge of brazing, so for now I'll stick to my methods.
Alright, hopefully this goes well. This is the most difficult thing I've ever done. I think that might be as far as I want to go. Alright, that was quite painless actually. I'm very impressed with myself.
The threads were now done, so it was now time to move on to the next part of the blade, the pommel. I think I'd say that the pommel is the most important fitting in the blade's actual use because it helps balance everything out and keep the sword wieldable. Now, the idea for this pommel was that I wanted to drill a hole in it, thread that hole, and just have me screw the pommel onto the tang, holding everything together. Now, this idea sounded good at first to me, but like some of you probably already noticed, my pommel isn't circular. This means that it would be extremely difficult to get everything lined up, and it would make doing a takedown construction essentially impossible. I knew this at the time, but I once again left the problem for future Jesse to solve.
Alright, that should be every main piece of the construction. I think I can just put everything together now. Alright, let's see if this goes down all the way. If it doesn't, I need to cut the threads shorter. Why is it tilted? And why is it not tilted anymore? What? Alright, you will not believe how long it took to get this to line up. It's not perfect yet, but it's enough for the bedding.
Now, what is bedding the tang? Essentially, my handle block currently fits onto my tang, but there's a lot of gap. What bedding does is it fills those gaps with epoxy and ensures that the handle block fits onto the tang with 100% contact like a glove. To do this, I coat everything that I don't want to stay stuck together with Vaseline, which is literally everything but the handle block. I then epoxy it together and then take it apart right when the epoxy becomes tacky but not fully cured. Doing so will ensure that it can come apart later, but still allow the epoxy to take the shape of the tang.
I think what I can do now is leave it for 4 hours, 4.5 hours, and come back, break the seal, and then put it back on. This is so bad. Oh my god, this is so bad. I came to check on it to like pull it apart, but it was stuck. So then I took it apart, and now it doesn't go all the way back on. What does one do in this situation? Like, this thing is threading worse and worse because it keeps getting gummed up. And the handle doesn't come off anymore. Oh, it came off. If I can't get it all the way on, I'll put a spacer. But obviously we don't want that to happen. Why isn't it going on? This is so annoying. I shouldn't have done this construction. Like, this is a really strong construction. Nothing is gonna break it. Nice, okay, very little gap. I'm scared to leave it alone because what if I come back in an hour and then I can't take it off? Okay, I'm taking it apart one more time, putting one more layer of whatever the heck I put on the Tang and putting back together. And then we'll call it good there. I'm gonna leave it there. I'm gonna check on it every hour and just take it apart. This is so stupid, oh my gosh.
All right, I can admit that was a little chaotic, so let's move on to something a little bit more peaceful, the sheath.
All right, for the sheath, I'm gonna use this. This is called Catalox, also known as Mexican ebony. Look at all those curls. These aren't saw marks. These are curls like inherent in the wood. I think one polish is gonna look really sick.
I got this board from a place called Woodworker Source, a place local to me. The guys there were nice enough to cut me a section of this board that had the best figure, so if you're in the area and need some nice wood, I highly recommend you go check them out.
Okay, I want us to go just a little bit deeper, just so I have some clearance. So I think I'm gonna carve out all the way to like right here. And I'll do it a little bit bigger, so the tip has like extra room.
Alright, hopefully this goes well.
As you can see, I decided to use a router to remove all the material for the sheath. I felt that it was the best tool available to me. Yes, I also have a mill, and I think that would have also worked for this, but I didn't want to throw wood shavings all over my machine, and I think it would have actually been slower than the router.
This is so much more stable than the Ryobi router, it's not even funny. I was actually doing it on hard mode before.
Previously, the router that I used was a battery-powered Ryobi router. It did the job, but I ran into some issues using it. Firstly, the depth of cut kept changing. Obviously, this is super annoying, and it doesn't lend itself to quality work. Another thing was that it was super light, so my wrist tendons always got super sore trying to keep it steady. After using it on 3 or 4 projects at this point, I decided that I had enough of it and I wanted to upgrade. This right here is a Makita corded router, and it's so much nicer. I literally have no complaints other than the fact that the depth setting mechanism is kinda bad.
Boom!
Just like how it is on a katana, the function of the Tunkou is to hold the blade into the saya. To ensure that I got the best fit possible, I final shaped the Tunkou before I moved on to hand carving the opening on the wood.
Okay, it's cuttable with chisels, so this shouldn't be too bad. I was expecting like my chisel wouldn't even dig into it.
Just for reference, the wood that I was using had a Janka hardness of around 3600, and to put into context with other species of wood, hickory has around half that at around 1800. In the past, I've made other saya from much softer wood called poplar, and that only has a Janka hardness of 520. I did all this research before I did any carving, so I knew that it would be difficult, and I'm really happy that I decided to use the router, because if I had to hand carve this whole thing, I would have probably been there for an entire week.
Whoa.
No!
No, that's okay.
I was doing some thinking about who really invented the idea of the Tunkou/habaki, and I came to some interesting results. Katana history stretches back a little over 1,000 years, with the earliest one appearing around 900 AD. As for the Jian, the earliest one appeared 1500 years before even that, in 500 BC. This makes me think that it was probably a Chinese bladesmith that invented the idea, and it somehow spread to Japan, and was adapted for a different style of blade. I think there's a small chance that it was neither a Chinese or a Japanese smith that invented it, and it came from another part of the world entirely, but who knows.
Okay, so I'm doing final fit-ups, and this tape is actually adding a lot of thickness to the blade, so I need to take it off and risk scratching my blade now. Center. Oh! Oh, getting stuck. If it's getting stuck before the habaki, I just need to make sure that my edges are wide enough. Let's see what it looks like with all the fittings. Yeah! Yeah, that looks pretty damn good. It goes all the way in until there, and then you have to push it in for it to go all the way in, which is exactly what I want.
The two saya halves were now perfectly carved, so now it was time to glue them together. I was trying to decide whether to use wood glue or epoxy for this, but the guy at the wood store actually told me that if I wanted pure strength, epoxy was probably the best option. The epoxy that I'm using is the same one that I use for everything else. It's a 24-hour G-Flex West System epoxy with a toughening agent.
This in there. Yeah! Oh, that is so sweet. Sweet victory. Okay, it's been 24 hours. Time to declamp this thing. Oops. This is basically every major piece of the build. Now it's just time to refine and make them look pretty.
The first fitting that I decided to shape was the handle block itself, and not fully, I just wanted to profile it. Both my guard and my pommel were supposed to connect seamlessly to this handle block, so it made sense that I did this first so I could profile those after according to it. Now, when you look at a traditional Jian handle, you'll probably see one of two handle shapes. The first style you'll see is basically just a long cylinder. It should be fairly obvious, but I wasn't going to be going for such a construction. The second style is a flatter, more ovular handle, more similar to my rough sketch from earlier. This extra girth is most likely added to improve control, due to a more one-handed use case. With the handle block profiled, I moved on to the guard. However, during the grinding process, I kept having this internal debate about my handle design. Earlier, I sketched scallop patterns on both the guard and the pommel, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt it might make the piece a little too busy. After a lot of back and forth, I decided to trust my gut. Instead of adding file work to the guard and the pommel, I decided to flute the handle block itself. I felt that sandwiching the file work in between the two mirror polished pieces of brass would both enhance the flutes and not make things too busy. I'd never tried fluting a handle before though, so I was curious to see if I could actually pull it off.
Okay, time to do something that I've never showed on camera. This is a tilt grinder, so I can do this. I can put this here, and I can do this. Ha ha ha!
The reason I pulled up my small wheels here is because the inside radiuses on the guard had to be exactly the same on both sides. I could theoretically do this with my flat platen in the corner of my belt, but why bother when I have a tool that can do the job better? To check how symmetrical my grinding was, I used the trick that I saw Kyle Royer use before. Essentially, I traced the outline of the guard on some paper, and then I flipped it upside down to check to see if it still lined up with the pencil. If it lined up perfectly and there was no gap, I could almost guarantee that my piece is symmetrical.
So I drew the lines, line up perfectly. Flip. Probably off by like a hair in one spot, but that's like damn near good enough. And I'm going to be rounding everything later anyway, so...
Up next to profile was the pommel, but before I could do that, I'd finally gotten sick enough of that terrible construction technique that I decided to completely redo my pommel hardware. After drilling out all of the threads with a larger drill bit, I made hidden lineup pins that would connect the pommel to the handle block in the same way every single time. I have no idea why I didn't just do this earlier, but if I had to guess, it's probably because past Jesse was a lazy bastard and he thought he was smart.
Oh my god, this is actually crazy. Look at this. Handle goes on, and then with these alignment holes, the pommel goes on perfectly square in both directions, no gap, and there's a spot right here for a pommel nut to go into. That's pretty crazy.
I still needed to make a pommel nut to get everything to stay together, but I didn't have a lathe, and so I had to wait for the next day to make a trip up to a friend's shop to use theirs. Before then though, I still had time to profile my pommel. I made sure to give myself a bunch of scribe lines to ensure that I could get everything symmetrical. This might be a little bit overkill, but with how much time I spent redoing the hardware, I didn't want to mess up and have to redo everything. In terms of what shape I was actually trying to grind this to, it was basically the same as what I sketched earlier.
Oh, that's so hot. Imagine just a pommel nut tighten. Oh my god, this is a takedown. This is a takedown Jian. It's like pretty well weighted already. Like when the guard is gonna lose at least like 30-40% of its weight Oh my god. This is coming together. It's coming together, and I think it's gonna be sick. Alright, time to create a lot of wood dust.
I still had some time left in the day, so I decided that the best thing I could do right now was shape my saya. I had left a lot of extra mass in the saya to make the carving a little easier, but all of it had to be removed eventually. I could have just ground it all into dust with the grinder, but so much wood had to be removed from the faces that it would be such a waste. I ended up using my bandsaw and slicing these large chunks off the side that were thick enough to be used as scales for a full tang knife. From what I could see online, most Jian saya were either rounded and ovular or beveled with a central ridge on both sides. I ultimately decided to go for a more rounded shape because the wood I was using had such excellent figure, and I wanted that to be the focus, rather than the grind lines themselves. It was now finally time for me to make the pommel nut and bring everything together. To make this, I went up to Turner's Warehouse, a woodworking supply that has the coolest array of machines. The owner, Chad, was kind enough to let me come in and use his antique lathe. Now, the first step to making a pommel nut is basically just to drill a hole and thread it. It's really important for this hole to be extremely perpendicular to the piece and centered, so the lathe was a really nice place to do it. When the hole was drilled and threaded, it was now time to flip it around and start turning down the diameter. Previously, I had made a small sketch of exactly what I needed, so this part wasn't too difficult.
Nice. Alright. Finished pommel nut. Just goes straight in here. Look at that.
The last thing that I wanted to add to this pommel nut at their shop was to drill a hole in the end of it so that I could put a rod in it later to tighten it down. Chad showed me this super cool machinist trick with a thin ruler that helped me find the center and drill the hole accurately.
Oh.
I thought that trick was super cool and it made drilling the hole extremely painless. Because of that, I had a little extra time, so I threw it back into the lathe and I tried to put a little hollow right on the hole just for some extra flair.
No! No, I'm so stupid. Do you have anything else? Here's a magic trick. Pommel seats. Pommel nut goes in, starts screwing, and then with an 1/8 inch drill bit, I can just, and it goes on all the way, seats tight, and voila, look at that. It's all one piece, and it fits in the sheath. Like that. So perfect. Seats all the way. Like, what more could you want? What more could you want?
The second pommel nut was basically done now, but I still wanted to have a little chamfer right where the hole was and also dome the end of it. To do this, I threw it in my drill, carefully ground it with the small wheel and the flat platen. When I was happy with how those looked, I took it over to my buffer and polished it. With the mirror polish, the pommel nut was currently the most complete piece of the sword, which is ironic because it was the one that I started on the latest. I'm not sure if I decided to do this because I'm a masochist or something, but I wanted to make some brass ornaments to put on both sides of the saya. I knew that it would take a lot more time, but I thought that it would look super cool when everything was all said and done. Now, the method that I chose for making these was the same that I used on Shusui. Essentially, the plan was to bend these pieces of brass to the exact same shape as the saya, solder it together, and then solder a sheet on top.
Look at that. It already seats pretty tight. I don't know about you, but that's pretty damn good. Oops. Low key, I think one little bit of solder should be enough.
There's actually a lot of stuff that went wrong during the soldering, but we're already over an hour into this video, so I'm not going to show you too much of that. And all I'm doing in the video right now is I'm grinding down the excess brass to make it look like one cohesive piece.
Soldered piece. Now, boom. And the blade has to go in, so I have to cut out the perfect shape of the blade.
The opening that I need to carve into this ornament needs to be the exact size as the Tunkou. By scribing the outline, I know exactly what material I have to remove. And as you saw there, the tool that I'm going to use to remove this material is the jewelry saw. I think the amount of time that I've saved by learning how to use a jewelry saw is actually comparable to the time saved with the mill. This opening right here is fairly awkwardly shaped. There's no round lines, so carving it out with drill bits isn't going to be the best option, and even if I did, I would have to file out a lot of extra material.
What is that hanging on by? Oh, nothing.
Because I can't really cut perfectly straight lines with a jewelry saw, I still had to file a little bit, but it's a lot less than if I had to just do this from a bunch of holes.
It should work. All right, I'm gonna put this on here. I don't know if I want to do it all the way yet. Oh my God!
The last ornament that I had to make before I could move on to putting details on everything was the ornament that I was going to put on the tip of my saya. The process for this was basically the same as the last one though, so I'm not going to show you too much of it. Fluting a handle has always been on my bucket list. For those of you who don't know what fluting is, here's some examples. Yeah, it looks freaking awesome. The only problem is that I've never tried it before and I had no idea how to do it. Luckily though, I've spent over 50 hours watching other people do it on YouTube, which basically makes me a master at it. If you couldn't tell, that was a joke. Anyways, to flute the handle, the first thing that I did was actually shape the handle as if there were gonna be no flutes. I really wanted to do a museum fit between this handle piece and my garden pommel, so I needed to shape this and then scribe lines according to that shape before I did any fluting. Now, I was planning on doing 12 flutes around this entire handle, and that meant I needed really good layout lines before I did any file work. To ensure that they were accurate, I made this circle with a protractor and I double checked it like 4 separate times.
I've never done this before. I've seen people do it a billion times on YouTube. How hard could it be? All right, my goal is to first get them started on every end. Honestly, that's pretty good. Some of them I went a little bit off the line because the line wasn't fully accurate, but I think that's a really good start for this side. I'm gonna get the other side started and then I can start connecting them. Wait, this is so unbelievably satisfying. Maybe I should do this for every knife I do from now on.
I didn't expect it at all, but this fluting process was one of the most fun things that I've ever done. Gidgee is an extremely oily and dense wood, so I expected it to clog up the file, but it didn't do that at all. It moved so cleanly and was one of the most satisfying things I've ever cut with a file. I'm not super into ASMR, but it really did feel like I was tickling a section at the back of my brain.
Alright, what I'm doing now is I'm just using a square file to widen the angle a little bit. Like it's only 30 more degrees, but it's actually doing a lot more to make it feel and look round. This is really, really fun though. Like I don't know why I didn't do this earlier. I think I was scared of how long and how difficult it would take. That made... What happened to my English? Oh, that feels so cool. Oh my. That already feels cooler than it should, I'm not gonna lie.
As of right now, my flutes were basically just trapezoids sitting next to each other, but I wanted them to be round. To hit the apex without gouging in the other side, I ground the sides off of this Nicholson file.
I've gotten the right side of every single one, and it sort of looks like a rotating gear. It already feels very different, so I'm gonna just flip it around and do the other side. Jian handles are usually very like circular, so I left this end fairly circular, but I left the middle a bit wider, and it is, you can still tell it's round like a Jian handle, but there's enough ovality or whatever for me to tell exactly where the edge is, and that's really important.
The flutes were in now and awaiting final polishing, so I figured it was a good time to shape the guard and the pommel as well. Now, I've always been sort of a hater of the small wheel and round contact wheels in general because the flat platen is just so versatile, but the small wheels sort of came in clutch for this build. The curves that I wanted to put on the fittings would have been super difficult to do accurately with the flat platen, and the small wheels made the whole process just seem so much more intuitive and easy. On a quick side note, something that I've noticed over the past few videos is that these builds might actually be getting too cool. Early on in the channel, the builds were simple enough for me to easily talk over them in post and bring everything together fairly quickly. But lately we've been shooting almost twice as much footage, and the builds have gotten complicated enough that a lot more things tend to go wrong along the way. For example, we started filming this video back in early September, planning to release it on October 18th. But the process ended up taking longer than expected, and we had to push it back by a week. I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that I'm curious as to what you guys think about this. Personally, I'm totally fine with continuing to ramp things up and making even crazier builds, but it would come at the cost of slower uploads. Right now, I think we average a video every month to month and a half, and I can easily see that going to every 2 to 3 months. So if you guys are willing, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll take them into consideration.
Oh yeah, it's a one-hander, two-hander combo if you need it, 1.5 hand. Oh my god, that feels good. That feels like I can like swing it. Oh my god.
The last thing to shape before I could move on to final polishing everything was to give the saya ornaments a little bit of sparkle. I decided to keep the theme of the Tunkou and just carve a curve into them. I started this by cutting a small line with my portaband, but I was scared of it getting caught and bending, so I moved over to my grinder. This worked pretty well. After I was done with that, I brought it over to my bench and trued up all the lines with a hand file. I think they ended up looking pretty sick, and this process didn't take too long to do at all. With that done, I now finally reached a point where I could truly finish part of the sword, the saya. Essentially, all I had to do left was polish these ornaments, hand sand the wood, and apply a finish. I was kind of craving that little hit of dopamine from actually completing something, so I decided to do this now. In general, the best way to get a mirror finish on something is to hand sand it up to 600 grit, maybe a little higher if the material is harder, and then buff that finish to a shine. My fittings were made of brass though, so I figured with some careful machine polishing I could skip the hand sanding altogether and still get that perfect mirror finish. To do this, I used surface conditioning belts. These are a bit different from your standard ceramic or aluminum oxide belts, as they're made from the same material as a Scotch-Brite pad. These don't remove much material, but they're great at smoothing out surfaces and giving a clean machine shine, which is exactly why they're perfect for polishing. I had 4 grits to work through, brown being the coarsest and gray being the finest. For each grit, I alternated the direction of the grind so I could easily see when the scratches from the previous grit were gone. This left me with a much cleaner overall finish. Now, for the first 3 grits, I just used the belts as they were, but once I got to the gray belt, I added a bit of green polishing compound to push the shine even further. It seemed to work super well, and definitely improved my confidence that the buffer was going to be able to bring these pieces up to a mere shine. It may not look like it, but the buffer is one of the most dangerous tools in my shop. If I hold when I'm buffing the wrong way, the wheel could grab it and throw it away at like Mach 7. Another factor is that the wheels actually heat up my piece fairly quick. Because of this, I had to be super careful when buffing these and cool them down in water often. Luckily, my patience paid off though, and I managed to get the best polish I've ever gotten on these ornaments. With the ornaments polished, it was finally time to finish the sheath itself. What I'm doing here is I'm hand sanding everything to only 220 grit. From my experience, it doesn't really help the finish to go any higher than this, and it actually makes it more difficult for the oil to soak in.
Watch the magic happen. Okay, this wood is really thirsty. I'm gonna have to not do it standing up. Oh my god, look at that color. Oh my gosh. I need to use this wood again. This is insane. I'm starving.
This finish really needs multiple coats to get it to pop, so I let it cure for around 24 hours and sanded it really lightly with 1500 grit sandpaper. I wasn't removing much material at all, I was just smoothing down the surface to ensure the next coat went on smoothly.
Oh yeah, that looks really good for even just a second coat.
I ended up doing 6 or 7 coats of true oil for the sheath, and for the last coat, I applied the oil with a foam brush to ensure that the final finish came out extremely clean. And as you can see here, it worked beautifully. With all the parts of the sheath done and awaiting final assembly, it was now time to polish the fittings and the handle. Now, I sanded the fittings in the exact same way that I did the sheath ornaments, so I'm not going to show you too much of that. What I am going to show you though is how I got this fluted handle ready for polishing. What I'm doing here is that I'm sanding a 45-degree chamfer onto the front and back of my handle block. I mentioned earlier that I wanted to do a museum fit up, and this is exactly how I was going to do that. I had to be extremely careful to keep everything clean and even, and I only went as deep as the flutes themselves went. When I was happy with how that looked, I did the same exact thing to the bottom of the guard and the top of the pommel. This was a little bit more difficult because it was made of metal and not wood, but it didn't end up being too bad.
Okay, top one looks pretty good. Bottom one's also pretty good. I'm gonna make the top one a tiny bit deeper, and then I think it'll be ready. That's so comfortable. Like, it adds just the slightest amount of texture, so it just, oh, it feels good.
My initial plan to get this handle ready for buffing was to just use the corner of the surface conditioning belt. This didn't really work though, and I was sort of scared that I was making the finish worse, so I ended up going back inside and just hand sanding it.
This is starting to look really sick.
To get the best finish possible on this handle when I go to buff it, what I found is the best thing to do is actually hand sand with oil. One of the byproducts of this is that you can see the final wood figure, and it looks really sick.
Oh my god, look at that. Oh my. That's such a good match to the wood on the saya. This is why Giji is #1 wood. You know what? For my first fluted handle, I think this looks pretty freaking insane. I'm really happy with it. I'm amazed you can see the wood figure so well too, but like you can see every single curl. Such an insane wood.
After buffing the wood, I spent some more time buffing every single fitting to a mere shine, and this is what everything looks like before final assembly. Finally, it was now time to return back to the blade.
The question is where I put the maker's mark. And the problem with that is it's a takedown. So traditionally it would probably be on the Tang, but I also want my name where people can see it. I think I'm gonna put it right above the habaki thingy, and I'm gonna do it on both sides. Alright, I think that's pretty good.
It's been so long since we forged this thing that I wouldn't be mad if you forgot that it's made from Turkish twist Damascus. For you to see it though, I have to actually go and etch it. Here I'm just cleaning it with Dawn dish soap to ensure that the etch is super clean.
Alright. Please be good. Please be good. I have no idea what the pattern looks like. I think we'll go 2 minutes because I poured a little bit of new ferric in there. Please, please, please. Oh yeah. Oh, that is so good. Let me neutralize it real quick. Wow, that is that looks pretty freaking sick. Oh my god, when everything's put together, it's gonna blow my mind.
To make the etch look even better, what I'm doing here is I'm cleaning up all the oxides with a piece of 2500 grit sandpaper. Doing this in between my etching cycles helps ensure that the pattern comes out super clean and there's a lot of contrast.
Alright, etch number 2. Marlo, what are you doing? It's not safe. Marlo, no! I hereby exile you. Okay, solid.
These past 2 etching cycles have been done in a mixture called ferric chloride. It's really good for getting depth in the pattern, but it's not so good at giving it color. To give it the contrast that it sorely needs, I'm going to be doing something called a coffee etch.
I think we might have to use all of this. Alright, the test to see if this is a dense enough coffee is the taste test. That's good. Doesn't even taste like coffee. Okay. Let's do this Tang. Now we let it sit for 4 hours. I'll check on it in 2. Alright, it's been 4 hours. I checked halfway through and it looked pretty consistent, so let's see what it looks like. Okay, that looks pretty freaking good. Okay, let me take off this wire and like rinse it, because I can't really tell under the coffee. Yeah, that looks really good. It's very, very even, very consistent. And if it looks this good before the carnauba wax, I can only imagine what it would look like after.
The very last step I had to do before assembling everything and calling this piece done was to put some carnauba wax onto the blade. An oil coating here would probably be sufficient, but the wax offers even more protection and helps enhance the look tenfold. Now, applying this finish is actually quite tricky. I have to heat the blade up to around 180 degrees Fahrenheit, melt the wax all over it, and then reheat it once it's fully coated to wipe off all the excess. This doesn't sound too bad, but for such a long blade, this process really took quite a while and left my forearm in shambles. When both the blade and the wax cool down to room temperature, the finish looks pretty dull and it almost looks like a downgrade compared to before. But the next step, where I buff the wax, is where all the magic happens. This yellow cloth right here is something called sunshine cloth. It was designed for jewelers and is essentially just a polishing cloth loaded with micro abrasives. It's by far the best thing to use for this step and leaves such a shiny finish. Considering how long this sword took to make, it kind of feels weird to finally be putting everything together. Every part of this sword has had so many man hours poured into it, and I got pushed so hard during every aspect of this build. I totally didn't plan for this, but a lot of my friends said that this sword looks like Sokka's meteor sword from Avatar. I swear that it wasn't intentional, but honestly, I'm not mad about it. Anyways, I want to thank you all for watching me build this sword from start to finish. It's been a long time coming, but I'm proud to finally present to you the finished Jian.